So we are very, I'm Christina. I'm the co-founder of Social Roots, which is a tech cooperative building um, infrastructure for network coordination and network coordinators across multiple networks. And we are thrilled today to welcome June Holley, who is the grandmother of networks, the maven of network relationship building. And I ran into June's work when I first started using Kumu, and am really excited to welcome her today. The original multiscalar research was done in 2018. So I'm also very curious to see where, June, you're getting to, and take it away.
Great. So can you put up the slide deck and we'll get going?
Sure. Do you want to do a brief intro and I'll get that deck up?
Well, so today we're going to talk not just about networks, but we're going to see that this form networks of networks, that networks aren't just a standalone thing like an organization. They're really messy. They're overlapping. There's so many networks around us. And I'm hoping one thing that you get out of today is to begin to see more and more of the networks around, and that there are already networks there that if we can see them better, are going to be able enable us to be much more innovative, much more transformative, and that we're going to be able to, if we really can see them and really support them, amplify them, we have a much better chance of, creating this world that's good for all of us, which I think most of the people here are all about. Okay, so am I gonna just tell you when I need it to change the slide, or is there some other way for me to do that? Okay, I just tell you when I need a slide. If you can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so I think we've covered that we're going to be talking about, all these different kinds of networks that maybe you didn't even realize had a name. So next slide. Now, just before we start, today is mainly going to be lots of definitions and trying to understand what different kinds of networks and networks there are out there. And we're going to also talk about how you can help one emerge. Or if you already are in network, how you, some more things that you can do to really make it very powerful. But we're hoping that in a couple weeks, we can organize a second session that is going to be a chance to answer questions that we didn't get to today, a chance to actually hear from different networks and networks all over the world and their experience, and lots of different, you can see how varied they are. And then we'll have break time where you can really think, well, how could I use this in the work that I'm doing? The other thing is I'm looking for a few people who might be part of monthly sessions on Social Roots to help us turn all this information into a workbook that can really help many more people than are here today, at this gathering. Next slide. So just a real brief overview of the session today. We're going to have two different big parts, and one is just about definitions, defining all the different types of networks and system networks and what that's all about. And then the second part will be, how do you go about catalyzing or helping a network of networks emerge? So two parts, and I really, really need you to ask questions. This is all pretty new stuff, and there's not a lot of clarity around it yet. And so if you ask questions in the chat, then which some people are already starting to, then I'll be able to address some of those, and either in this session or in the next month or week session when we have our second session. So really good question here. How do we connect networks across sectors? And that's exactly what networks of networks are. So yeah, and when things are so broad, what do you do? How do you get people to focus and act? Um, and oh yeah, Victor, I just love that. There's a change, and yeah, that's something that I think we'll be touching on a bit in this session. Okay, so let's dive into definitions, and I'll be stopping every number of slides to take some questions, and the good facilitators here are going to help kind of organize some of those questions. Okay, so part one, definitions. Next slide. So, before we start and talk about networks and networks, we have to talk about systems. And we have to talk of the kind of networks that we're talking about today, I call system shifting networks. And I think it's really important to understand just what that means. And so I have this lovely example here of that I think can help all of us understand what a system shifting network is. Because we're not trying to go from a bad system to a good system. What we're trying is the current dominant culture that many of us grew up in was one of, isolation, separation, hierarchy, individualism, we, they, conflict and struggle. And I think what we want to do is remember that that is not all there is out there. I think lots of us have wonderful little, and Margaret Wheatley calls them islands of sanity. We have places where already people are treating each other well. They're taking care of each other in our families and indigenous cultures. So we have so much to learn from in friendship networks that we have. And so I think we need to realize we're not starting from ground zero. We already have a lot that we can help foster and support and amplify. And so here's an example of a place in a desert community. Can we go back to the last slide? And you can see on the left-hand side, down at the bottom right, there's some patches here that are where the plants are really struggling. But what this community did that is so exciting is that they began to gather all the plants, indigenous and native plants throughout their region, and they brought them to this place. But they didn't just try to throw them in the ground. They tried out, you can see how there's different sections. They tried out different combinations of plants because what we found out, it's the ecosystem, it's the set of plants and how they interact and support each other that really makes a difference. So they planted all these sections and watched what happened. And as they saw, ooh, this combination seems to be really working, they helped spread that out. And so that after, because those plants were changing the system, the ecosystem. So you can see on the right-hand side that after a number of years, that the whole circle became a really supportive and healthy ecosystem. And I think that's what we're trying to do is be very experimental and try out different things to find out what is a healthy ecosystem that can support our communities so that we have a world that's good for all of us. So next slide. So what we want is to understand how do these networks form and emerge that can create these kind of ecosystems. So next slide, please. I mean, think of one way to think about it is like if you think of a pulley. Whoops, whoops. Okay, that I don't think that's the next slide. Oh, well, maybe it is. Okay, so that's the next slide. So now the word system is troubling in itself. Some people use it very mechanically, but I like to use it in sort of the ecosystem thing. But the thing is, it's a nice way when we think of the food system or health system, it's a nice way to kind of chunk out societies so we're not so overwhelmed because one of the problems is that you can become so overwhelmed by the complexity of our society and how do you begin to change it? And lots of us decide, okay, we're going to take this one problem and work on it. But the problem is that if we take that approach, we're not going to be able to change the whole system. And so what we need to do is learn how to see the whole big picture of the food system or the energy system, but be able to figure out where our work fits and how we can support other networks that are working in other parts of the system. We can't shift a whole system without seeing the whole and knowing the networks that are working in those spaces and how we can work together. So here's an example of a network of networks called REAMP, and they are working in the upper Midwest of the United States on climate change, and they're trying to lower emissions. And they found out that they finally decided the work that they were doing, which was shutting down dirty coal plants, that seems really reasonable, right? But when they did a system map, they realized that that was actually making the problem worse. That what was happening is that these coal plants were shutting down, and the communities were building new coal plants that were only a little bit cleaner, just enough to pass the guidelines, and were going to last for a really long time. That strategy really wasn't helping to shift the system to healthier forms of energy production. And so they did a system map and they realized, oh, we can see 4 different places where if we focus efforts, we can really start shifting the system. And so they started stopping new power plants from being built and working on alternative energy. But they realized that they couldn't do it. A single organization could not work on all of this at once. And so next slide. So what they did is they created a whole set of networks. And the idea is that, with a pulley, think about a pulley. Like if you use a pulley, you can pull down on it and you can lift here 100 kilograms. But if you combine loosely 3 different pulleys, all of a sudden you can lift 4 times the amount. And so that's the idea. Networks just give us so much more power and capacity. Next slide. So what they did was that they formed state networks, and those state networks would get together and figure out, what changed in our state so that we can see the opportunities for change in our state. And then the regional network, the REAMP network, began to coordinate networks to work from all the states to work on each of these leverage points or opportunity spaces that they identified. And they've had tremendous success. But then they realized after a number of years, what about all these marginalized communities, communities of color, low-income communities, indigenous communities? They're suffering from the current coal production energy more. They're in more cities that are more polluted. They're not getting access to alternative energy. And so they went outside their current network to other networks, such as the Midwest Environmental Justice Network and the Indigenous Indian Collective. And they also began networking with communities on the ground, and they formed another network that's called the Great Lakes Environmental Justice Thriving Communities Network. So you see that even people who think they're a network are really this kind of messy bunch of networks. And so think about your network that you're involved in, and is it really a network of networks? Is it really overlapping with other network efforts? So next slide. So let's pause now and just look at some definitions. Now, these definitions are not perfect. They're my best. I'd be glad for you to rework these or redefine these. But I see that there are 2 kind of, most networks now are either place-based networks. They're in a place like Western North Carolina that's trying to deal with disaster and now recovery. Or they're focal point networks. They're focused on a particular fairly narrow issue or strategy, like, we're a network supporting immigrants, or we're a network interested in community gardens. And then there are all these kinds of networks of networks. Now, network of network is just a general term for all the kinds of networks where most of the participants, probably not all of them are mainly networks rather than organizations. And so there's multiscalar network. I just love that word. It's networks that usually have more than one sort of level from local to state, regional, national, international. They have two or more of those levels involved in their network that usually will have a focus on a particular system or subsystem. And there's the system shifting networks, which is a term that I just love and would love to see some of these happen. I'm not really sure there are any whole system shifting networks out there. Like, is there a network that's trying to really connect all the climate change networks around the world? If you know of any that are doing things like that, or changing food system, transforming food systems, and working with networks all over the world. So that's a big basket. But I'm hoping that more of that will happen because it's amazing how many, say, groups, environmental groups, are not even barely talking to each other right now, or one's working on education, or any of these sectors that we talked about. Um, uh, there's not nearly as much networking among them as I think is really important for us to see. Then there's subsystem networks, which are just a part of a larger system. Like, so in healthcare, you might have a subsystem network focused on national rural healthcare, uh, and so forth. And then there are cross-sector or cross-system networks that include networks from different systems, like Catalyst 2030, or now it's called Catalyst Now, that's working on the Sustainable Development Goals, would be an example of that. But there's also lots and lots of learning networks or communities of practice that are really cross-sector, and they're bringing together people from different networks. And then there's the really important field building, capacity building, or support networks that are trying to serve, a lot of networks out there. Places like Phyto Network, and if you aren't familiar with them, check out that link there and check them out, because they're really providing support and bringing together, convening lots of different networks. So next slide. So that's now, if you have some other kinds of networks that you've seen, let me know. But now let's talk. So why do we have to have all these complicated different kinds of networks? And it's because even though our current networks that are mostly focused, somewhat narrowly, you can get a lot of things done. You can get some really exciting work there. But what I've found is I've been interviewing networks and talking to networks and networks, that you need more outside perspectives, and you can get that in a network of networks. You need to do intense learning. I feel like part of the reason we're not making as much progress as we want is that we need to be doing much more deep learning to figure out what's working, what's not, what are the patterns of success. How can we get out of our dominance mindset and the way it blinds us, and seeing what needs to be done? And we need to be sharing with each other what we're doing. So many groups are innovating so incredibly beautifully, but they don't have any venues or places or platforms where they can share not what they're doing, but what they're learning, what breakthroughs they're making, what innovations they're making, and sharing that with others. And people need support with challenges. I've come across so many groups, and they say, "Oh, we had this problem." I said, "Oh, have you talked to so and so? They've already dealt with that challenge. Let me connect you with them, because they'll be able to tell you what they did, and I bet you can learn something from them." And if we ever want to do really large scale kinds of things, we have to be connected, more connected. Now, and we also need to develop what I call the support ecosystem. We have to figure out communications. We have to figure out how to support all the network weavers we're going to need. And it's best to work on that with other networks. Most single networks don't have the capacity to figure all that out. So there's lots of reasons. Now, the key, of course, is how do we do this without being overwhelmed? And, that's part of what we're going to have to learn together. So let's pause just for a minute. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So if you can look back at that and just in the chat, if you could just talk about like what system are you working on? You may be a small part of it, but which one of those 12 or so that I listed are you part of? Share if you would in the chat that. And then which one of those different kinds I gave how many was there? 8 or so different kinds of networks? What kind of network? Yeah, can we display those lists again so people can see? What kind of network? Are you a focal area network or a place-based network, or are you a network of networks? Um, okay, we've got some great examples of some people. Maybe Naren, you could explain if you know the names of some of the networks that you're working with. I think it'd be great to hear. Yeah, impact investing across all sectors, system shifting. Oh, I forgot to mention, you can be more than one of those. Yes, so you can be a system shifting network at the same time you're a cross sector network. Yeah, so you can be more than one, and many place-based networks are both local and regional, or a focal area network is often, local as well as maybe national. So let's see if we can just take a look at this.
So June, the biggest
Wow.
question.
David, please explain what you mean in the chat. That networks that are networks, but they don't, but they are seen as different because of the narrative that activates them. The network.
Yeah, I guess so. The theory, Jane, is kind of that we conflate all these words, network and community and ecosystem, and we bounce around with them, and I don't think we've tugged apart at what we mean for how to use them in a change strategy. So I greatly appreciate the work you're doing on this stuff. Thanks for doing this session. The version I've been playing with, so I'm working like in a regeneration space. I want to create a regenerative future, and that regenerative space overlaps with a whole bunch of the lists that you had.
Yeah.
And so your people have a lens into the regenerative space from their perspective. Now, those people are connected to each other in various ways. We get on Zoom calls and stuff, or we don't. So we're connected or we're not connected. That underlays the narrative that we see ourselves in. So our connectivity, our ability to communicate with each other, to have a flow of resources is always there. And it kind of independent of the lenses. But then when you put the narrative of, in my case, regeneration on top of the network, you see how there's different parts of the network that matter or are weak or could be strengthened. And people live in the narrative, right? You see the world through your understanding of it, which is narrative. So I've been trying to put the two ideas next to each other and see if you can explore narrative separately from network.
Because we've got to really see the big picture. We've got to at least understand how connected everything is. That's just a huge mindset or worldview shift. And so even though we're scared to do that because it's so overwhelming, all the connections within a space, and of course the regenerative one is really huge because it is a cross system network. It's trying to combine things about food and environment and lots of different pieces. And so I think I'd love to hear more. And if you have a link that you can share, David, that would be really great.
Some of this stuff is emerging. I mean, one of the notions is that the narrative is also a commons. And so there's parts of the network that need to be kind of commons stewards for the narrative.
Yes. And I think that, and when we talk about the support ecosystem, that is a big commons. And, okay, somebody has a hand raised. And
June, the
ahead.
biggest question I've seen most people ask is, can you define the difference between a network and a community?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, the way I look at it is that they're not mutually exclusive. A network is a view that's looking at relationships. I think a community has a sense, and networks can be, like I call, purpose agnostic. They can be, they don't have to, have any particular kind of uh, glue other than the relationships. They can, and most of them do. But a community tends to all of a sudden, and networks don't have boundaries. I mean, formal networks, they can have membership and things like that, but a network in the sociological sense that's about relationships don't have boundaries. If I get a connection to somebody new, that person is then part of the networks that I'm part of. And a community has a sense, is focused around belonging. And it's this idea that somehow we have some belongingness that brings us together and helps us, care for each other and feel responsible for each other in a way. But communities are networks as well. If you look through the lens, it's like taking off one pair of lenses. I think it's kind of what David's talking about too. It's like you take off one pair of lens, you look at it as a set of relationships. Like, so a community would want to look at, say, a network map and see, okay, we're supposed to be a community, but look at all these immigrants who are on the edge of this community. They're not really allowed into the community in a sense of relate. They're not connected to very many people, and so what does that say about us as communities? So communities need to look at themselves as networks. And lots of networks will want to build a sense of community. Not all of them, but many of them will want to build that sense of belonging and caring.
Braden wanted to add some context to that question in particular.
So go ahead. Do you want to speak? Can you?
June, nice to see you again. Yeah, no, I asked that question because like when the work I'm trying to do, I found that people, like, when people would ask, oh, is it a network of networks? And I would be like, no, it doesn't, or that's not what it felt like. There was something missing from that description. And so like, ultimately the aspiration that I want to achieve through my work is the salience of planetary community, which is, there's more to it than just like the connection of like a network connection. But it is like it's sort of like you said, they're sort of like combined. So like, how would a network go on to evolve into a community? So like, let's say we start out with networks and we want to sort of create that sense of belonging and like mutual care that I think is characteristic of a community. So how, like, is that something that you've looked at, or like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I mean, and part of, but there's a danger around community too, because it feels like it has a boundary, and that's the difficult part about the way people use community and belongingness. If it's used to, okay, all the people have to think like me for me to feel comfortable and safe in a community, well, that's dangerous, because then we don't get provoked into new ways of thinking. We don't get that contrast. So, I mean, these are all tensions. And hey, guess what? The world that we're moving into is full of tensions and contradictions and things that we have to keep working on and thinking about together. And so, yes, you can create community, but you can also create relationships of care without too strong a sense of community. So it's just it's something that, and I'd love to hear people respond about that. Like, what are your thoughts about that? About the dangers of trying to create community. So, and the benefits of it. I think that we've got to think about both. And, are there ways that we can create a sense of belonging that isn't exclusionary, that doesn't have boundaries, that isn't based on a particular set of ways of thinking that everybody has to have in common? Because that's the thing that I find. It's like if you say, oh, I want to be in a community of like-minded people, alarms go off in my head and saying, well, does that mean that you're not going to? I mean, why do you think that really healthy community things haven't spread all over the world? It's because there is the inability, I think, of so-called progressive people that I assume many people are here to actually be able to reach out of their comfort zone and to reach out into places where they're not going to feel comfortable, where people don't think alike. And that's the trick. Like, how can we find what commonality, what ground do we have to stand on with people who are very different, who see the world very differently than us? But are there places where we can come together and do something creative? But it's not going to feel like communities. this is all very, very interesting stuff. Okay. Any more big question, Anna, that you want to?
There were a lot of different types of questions, so I think continuing on is probably best.
Okay. So next slide then. Let's go on here. Keep those questions, because if we don't get to them today, we will get to them. This is not a short-term interaction that we're having. We're building our own network or community or whatever you want to call it here to really begin grappling with these things. So just want to point out that if you're part of a network now, and of course we're part of family networks, friendship networks, but if you're part of a network that's focused, a focal network, a place-based network, you can start building that network of networks right now. You don't have to wait for money or permission. And what I've seen is like little groups of people in networks saying, okay, we're going to be a new kind of network weaver that's all about reaching out to other networks. And so you begin to like set up a mural board or a post-it board somewhere and start Googling, like, what are all the climate change networks? What are all the regenerative networks out there? What are all the healthcare networks out there? What are all the education networks? Put post-it notes up and web pages and start to get names connected to some of those networks. Start subscribing. And now you've got to be the kind of person like me who is not easily overwhelmed by excess information. You need to be a person who's comfortable subscribing to 50 blogs or newsletters and letting them just sift through you and being a filter. Like, I'm a filter. Like, I try to be a filter, like on LinkedIn or whatever, and just say, I read all this stuff this week, but here's the 5 things that I think are really that I want to pass on. So you do that, and you pass on just the few precious things to your network. And then you start reaching out to people in those other networks and saying, what are you up to? What are your challenges? What do you need support? Are there any places we could begin working together? And that's how you start, most networks of networks I'm seeing out there that don't have $1 million. I mean, there are some networks that started with $1 million grant and they're able to have coordinators and, all kinds of fancy projects, but you don't have to have that to start being, a network ambassador. I don't know. We got to get a new name for it. So I guess we took a bunch of questions so we can kind of go on. A couple things though. Networks and networks generally differ from networks because networks and networks tend to not just say, this is our strategy, we're going to do it. A lot of networks have a strategy or a set of strategies they're doing. But networks and networks are often like, oh, we want to bring together all these networks with different strategies so they can learn from each other and be provoked by each other and really, help see where each is working in that big, giant network map. They're more focused on learning. Can you go back to the last slide just because I can't remember? And then and there's more focused on the support ecosystem, thinking of network weavers and communication and those kinds of things we'll talk a little bit more about later. Okay, next slide. Okay, so, and networks of networks are really different. I mean, because they're a new animal. And so, I've been interviewing a bunch of them. And it's amazing how different, like what are they focused on? Are they just a geographic one and often those are looser and, big subsystem. Teach for All is this enormous international, network of networks. And a lot of it has to do with money. I mean, if you have little money, you don't have much money for coordination. You don't have time to spend on endless meetings designing your structure. Whereas if you have more money, often you can be more coordinated and have more structure. But these are just things that we're learning are really different. And you can have different functions that you're prioritizing. Next slide. And so, let's just skip this one. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to just go through two examples, and hopefully if we get this session set up in a few weeks or sometime the next month, we'll get some real live cases of the different kinds of networks and networks. One of these examples is fairly structured, the other very informal, but both have been very successful. And I just want to get the idea that it's not like there's a recipe for a network of networks. So in the US, there's this food policy network of networks, and it has a lovely vision. It's trying to create a more just food system. Next slide. And there are 300 and some local and state and regional policy networks. So it's a multiscalar network. It has, local, state, regional, and national. Next slide. And it does a bunch of things, but the main thing it does is it's a learning network and sort of a practice network. And so people want to learn something, like I did one for 6 months or something on network weaving and how can you build healthier networks in your local communities. But they have all sorts of different ones about different strategies and different policies that people have done in one community, and then they're sharing it with others. But it's quite structured. It has a staff of a couple people, and they do most of the coordination. So next slide. But every 18 months they do, like, what have we been able to accomplish as a whole network? And it's really quite astounding, all the different policies on the many different levels that have been passed. So, example of a somewhat structured. And then next slide. Then the next one is from where I live in Appalachian, Ohio. And this network's been going on for like 25 years. And you could loosely call it a local food economy network, but it's got all kinds of networks of manufacturers and farmers and restaurants and economic development people, government, schools, whatever. Bless the breweries, and next slide. But this network has never, ever all met in one room. It's never even had a sizable community. It's very relationally based. It's totally based on everybody knowing everybody else. And, that can happen in this. And it doesn't have just one purpose either, because some people are interested in food access. Other people are just interested in supporting food entrepreneurs. But they've had, I think that in the last 25 years, they've had thousands of collaborative projects, from very small ones, dozens of we have Pawpaw Festival, we had the Shrimp Festival. There's just Little Cities of the Black Diamonds Festival. There's just endless festivals that are different collaborations and all these other activities. So again, very successful, but they do it all through just people knowing each other and coming up with a creative idea. It's a real self-organizing network. Somebody says, oh, I have an idea I want to do a shrimp festival. There's all these new shrimp farmers around. And so they get a group of people together and they do a shrimp festival. And so, a very different kind of mode of, in some ways, it's similar to the other one in that they're figuring out what they want to learn or know or do, and a group gets together and does it. Okay, next slide. So, I'd love to hear from you, like, what of this is interesting to you and what you think you might, okay, we're getting, okay. I love this trauma-informed practices. Yes, well, Okay, next slide. Let's just keep, okay, are there any new questions, Anna, that popped up that we could address?
Some of the questions are a little bit like, how do we explain this to people? How do we get funding? Like, what's an example of a problem that networks solve better than any one organization alone? That's sort of the theme.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so yeah, explaining that. I mean, I think we're all going to have to keep working together to try to explain this. And you'll have access to these slides. You can use ones that make sense to you. I think that and how do you get funding for these? Well, you start without funding and you just do something, and then funders can see, oh, there's a network of networks here. I think I'm going to support it. So I think doing some of that initial connecting, some of you are already doing this, but doing that maybe a little bit more explicitly, and then putting it on LinkedIn and other places, letting the world know that you are connecting networks, and then you begin to be more attractive, and we can, and looking for funding. Though I think we need to get out of the funding, the dependence on foundation funding, and start really looking, at some other kinds of things. So, I think that the thing about what can they do better, I think they can do everything better, because if you're working by yourself, you don't have enough insight about what you're doing. You don't have enough contrast. And I'm going to talk in just a minute about the transformative. I looked at hundreds and hundreds of kind of what I call connected experiments. You need to have people from other communities, other parts of the world, working on collaborative experiments where you are regularly sharing what you're learning, getting provoked by them, getting people questioning lovingly what you're doing. And I think that we could improve the impact of what we're doing just incredibly, just by that simple thing of not working, alone. And yeah, I mean, networks aren't exactly alone, but they're more alone than a network of networks. And I just think that we need to really make the case, and I want you to help me make the case for this, and talk about ways that I and we could express this better. So let's move on to the next part, because we only have so much time. I'm hoping we'll get through most of it. So how to catalyze a network of networks. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. So, what I'm suggesting is that start now, don't wait for money. Just start with the network weaving. We're going to talk about that, get some activities going, and then you can become more formal and, get some coordination and structure. It just seems like that's the way that really works. And I've got these 5 big steps. One step is really big, you can see, and that's what I'm going to talk most about. But you need to have tons of network weavers, and network weavers that are more than just people connecting, but they're able to catalyze, convene, they're able to help you learn. So that is a really important piece that I see a lot of people leaving out. And you'll get that handbook. Oh, let me put that link to the handbook in again. So you get a free copy to the Introduction to Network Weaving here. I'm trying to put it in here. There it is. And you can share it. But it's got a lot about network weaving in there, and there's a lot of great stuff on the Network Weaver blog too. But you have to start building those relationships. See, but then quickly as you can, you need to start getting people doing stuff together, because I believe trust is not something you can work out ahead of time, but comes from working together on collaborative projects, starting with pretty small stuff. I'd advise working together in a place where you can learn new, really healthy ways of interacting. That's where this trauma-informed comes. Where you can interact in ways and deal with the trauma that we pretty much all have from living in this culture. And then we need that support ecosystem. So next slide. So I'm just going to real quickly go over these so you have time to ask questions. So we talked about this. You've got to find out who's out there and find it. Just stop with the blinders so you're not overwhelmed and say, okay, I'm going to be overwhelmed once in a while, but I'm going to find out who's out there working on. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of networks out there, and if you can start to get some of these, I'd really. And if you want a list of funders that support networks, go to FITO Network. They have a whole section with about 50 funders that support networks. So just FITO, FITO .network, I don't know. Anyway, something like that. So really, the thing about these network weavers, now you may have heard that term, it's about it is not a job, it's not a role, it's something it's a role, I guess, that everybody in a network can play, and some will play it with more skill and spend more time on it than others, but everybody needs to understand network weaving. And if you don't, there's good stuff in that network weaver handbook thing that about how you explain and talk about that. But these network weavers, you need network weavers in your network that are focused on other networks. Next slide. And go on to the next one, because those are the books that you can. There's other places on the blog that you can learn about this too. And then you've got to really focus on building relationships. And so, next slide. What I suggest is, and if you don't know this closing triangles thing, it's really like if you go out and you talk to somebody in another network, you listen to them and you find out what's their challenge, what are they interested in, and you say, oh, I know somebody in my network who's into that too, and you begin to bring them together. So you don't become a hub, but you're starting to bring together people, and you might help them talk to each other so that they start thinking about, oh, well, who else is interested in this? What could we do? Could we get a learning group together to talk about this? And so it's just like magic. All of a sudden, you've got self-organizing starting to happen. So next slide. And so this shift to self-organizing, I'm telling you, this is the piece that is so undeveloped. And I want you to all think about trying to add this to your network as well as networks of networks. It really works for networks of networks. So this is when you connect people, they find something that they want to do together or learn together, and you support them and help make something happen. You learn from whatever it is you do, and you share that with others. So next slide. It's just so basic. Now, yeah, I'm going to skip over this a little bit, but when you bring people together, and this is something network weavers have to be able to do, facilitators of every meeting, they need to be, having breakout rooms where people can get to know each other. They need to practice a healthy culture, a trauma-free culture, a culture where you're going to get listened to, where you're going to support each other, you're going to interact as peers. Next slide. And you can do this. I have a values checklist that's great where people can take it and they can say, oh, wow, yeah, we're really open to new ideas, but, oh, we do have a little trouble letting go of control. Well, then they get together and say, what can we do about that? And they then get some strategies that can help build that culture. Because without that culture, we're going to keep falling back into competitiveness, into being impacted by trauma, into being angry or, whatever. And so we have to keep helping people move into a culture of caring and support, next, and collaboration. And there's all these microprocesses that some of them are in the handbook that can help people. Every meeting can have these microprocesses where people are encouraged to behave in these really healthy ways. I'm finding that transformation is about small things. It's about people consistently interacting in healthy ways with each other, day after day, and that begins to spread. And we don't have time to talk about that here, but there's ways you can help that kind of culture spread. And that is what can be a big part of, because when you do work and you know how to interact really in healthy ways, you're going to not waste time on, getting bogged down in conflicts that, you don't pay attention to. You'll know how to deal with stuff like that, and you'll know how to make that be more like a sneeze than pneumonia. Next slide. So then there's lots of different ways you can assess. You have a couple networks out here now. You have to find these opportunity spaces or interests, and you can use surveys, you can do simple network system mapping, and I've got some resources here, and there's actually people on this call, system innovation and stuff. People can help you with. Next slide. And some of the best work's being done. Anyway, we don't have time for that. Next one. But there's lots of people doing great things on system mapping and then how to identify the networks. So then you can start convening like really small things, like how do I get young people involved? And so get people from 5 different networks who want to get young people more involved. And maybe they meet once, maybe they meet 3 times, maybe they meet for 6 months. You can call it a community of practice or a learning cluster or whatever, but you start bringing people together. And it doesn't have to take a lot of time. You can have a pretty standard agenda. People share. They get support for challenges. It can be a pretty simple process. And then when you get your $1 million, next slide, this whole thing about starting to get, you find, wow, here's a opportunity space where if we got a bunch of people working, we could really start to figure out how to shift this food system or whatever. And so getting people together once a month from maybe all over the world, maybe, all over the country, and getting them to behave in some of these new ways while they're sharing and learning from each other. Again, we need our facilitators and network weavers to really know how to lead learning processes and how to do that. It's not just about, what went well, what could we change? No, it's digging in and really looking at. We need to spend so much more time noticing what we're doing and figuring out next steps. Okay, a few more things here. We'll get some questions. So this support ecosystem, this is like, I'm a gardener. I have very little yard, but I have a wonderful garden, and I spend a huge amount of time getting the soil, putting lots of different nutrients in it, and getting my compost that I make and all that. And the plants respond and they really grow like other people. I look at their gardens and they're like little straggly things because they haven't invested in the enabling conditions or the support ecosystem. We've got to start thinking together about this. And we do not have this figured out. But we really need to get, like, what are these new kinds of network weavers that are ambassadors, that are connectors across networks? What does that look like? How do we support them? How can we begin to bring them together monthly? That's a big thing that we need to start with soon. And then the communication ecosystems, and I'm going to let Anna talk about this because we're trying to figure out what does a communication ecosystem that allows us to know what's going on in all these networks and yet be able to not get overwhelmed. Anna, you want to talk a little about this?
Yeah, so me and Christina, we are part of the project called Social Roots. We're co-hosting this event with June. So Social Roots is a software platform that's run as a worker-owned co-op, and we got funded by the National Science Foundation to basically spend about 5 years researching this topic of what is preventing people from self-organizing in networks of networks, and what are the processes and technologies that are going to help. And what we learned was, in a nutshell, that basically most software is built hierarchically, and it's built to have 2 levels of self-organization instead of 3. So if you think about like Slack or project management tools or any sort of chat tools, they're made for one organization to use at a time. They're fundamentally sold to one organization. That's how they build the whole system. And it's a very hierarchical system. And then the second category of technologies out there is kind of social media. So if you think of Twitter and Mastodon and Facebook, And those are built fundamentally as public squares, and their business model is ad revenue. Um, and basically, there's not really a sense of any sort of community space. So then what we've seen communities use is things like portals, forums, listservs, and those are working better, but they're fundamentally siloed. And so you can't have that kind of multifractal subsetting and supersetting that you have to have agency and be able to scale across. Because fundamentally, there's always one person who owns everything, and one person can delete the whole Slack group, or can delete the whole Facebook group, or can delete the whole portal. And that really makes it hard to get people to feel motivated, because everybody wants to have some control over their work, over their information, their knowledge, their relationships. So basically, what Social Roots is doing, and we invite anybody who wants to join us to to participate in whatever way you want to, but basically we're building technology to break down this paradigm of hierarchy or completely public, and really build infrastructure that enables like scaling across, that's allowing autonomous networks of groups to both subset and superset, but with healthy boundaries.
Wow. Yeah, so I think we're going to do some experimenting with it when we work on the workbook that's going to come out of this. Okay, so next slide. Let's go on the next slide. I've got bonus slides. So we will set up like a YouTube channel or something, like a place space, the Social Roots YouTube channel, and I will put a link to these slides. You're allowed to take them, edit them, do whatever you want with them. You can attribute if you want to, but some of it maybe you don't want to be connected to. Okay, so then the last piece is just, it's so important that we share, like, so we do something with a networks of networks. It's probably going to be just a very small subset of all those networks. Networks tend to be often big and sprawly. So we have to have ways to really turn what we learn into knowledge and really share it. And we've got to stop using webinars to tell people what we're doing, and instead tell them what we're learning and give them time to figure out how to apply it to what they're doing. I feel like that we have to create these pathways for rippling. I call it, instead of scaling, it's like pathways for rippling or spreading. And we need to learn more about what kind of knowledge is really useful to each other, because I think we put a lot of stuff out there and waste a lot of people's time reading through stuff to get to the little nugget that's really going to be useful for our network. So anyway, that's just another piece of this network of networks piece that I don't want people to forget about. So next slide. I think we're just about, yeah. So next slide. So this is my new sort of model of transformations, very simplified. You can look at this later. And I think that this could make a huge difference in the world. But it really, networks of networks that are connecting is at the heart of this whole model. And so we need to figure out and learn how to know what's happening in that whole network space around the world. So next slide. Oh, okay. Do we have some questions? Has it been a little too fire hosey? Do you have questions?
So there are a lot of questions, but at this point, I'd love to have people ask verbally. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand.
Or just, unmute and say something.
I'll jump in. One thing I've found over the years is there's a lot of networks out there, a lot of network platforms. A lot of people saying, come to my space and be part of the work that's been done at my space. The difficulty with that is that you have your own space and your own work that you've been doing, and maybe for many years, And when you go into a new space, you go in as a unknown, and you are almost starting over. That becomes very difficult. Uh, uh, and if you think of multiple spaces inviting you to come into their space, that becomes almost overwhelming. Do you see that pattern, and how do you deal with it?
Well, I think it's better to, work on the human to human than I mean, platforms might be a pathway, but you want a pathway to find a human that you can connect to in another network and, begin to have a conversation with them, that where you are listening to them, finding out. And again, I think the more you can give, if you can give in that first interaction, like, oh, I can connect you to somebody. Oh, here's a resource you might not know about. That kind of primes the pump for this giving piece, and they're going to be more likely to give and to want to do something else. And so I think somehow we need to articulate that outside, that space, that nether space between the networks, and then not try to go into somebody else's space so much as create these. That's why these little learning clusters, they're creating a neutral space, a space where you're all equals, you can all learn from each other, rather than going into each other's space, because that there still tends to be some of the old culture ways when you have a bounded space. I don't know if it helps.
Can I ask Anna to chime in here?
Yeah, so like this is actually exactly the point I was making. So this is partly a power distribution problem, it's partly a technology problem. So part of the problem, Daniel, is when someone adds you to their portal or their community or their online chat, they own that space, right? These technologies are built so that one person always owns it. And fundamentally, no technology has ever been built that isn't that way until social roots. So the technology that we are building is specifically allowing every group to own their group, but still connect and still communicate as if they were in the same group.
Is
So
that built on the Fediverse model or like Mastodon and things like that?
So we are currently looking at who to integrate with that's decentralized. We haven't quite pulled the trigger on who to integrate with because the decentralized tech is very unpredictable and has very bad security. But yes, yeah, the goal is to integrate with decentralized tech. But the front end is decentralized in how it's made because every group can own its own group boundaries, but still be connected. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. And to June's point, I asked earlier in the chat, is there a hashtag where people, 50, 60 of us who are here today, could be continuing to connect with each other on different platforms? I went into a connected learning group in 2013 under the hashtag CLMove. And because of the way over time we kept sharing ideas and that the other thing, the relationships that June's talking about developed.
We'll make sure after this to give you guys ways to connect with each other. I promise you, I will do that.
And it requires a commitment on each person to make the time to connect. If just the three of us connect, then that's nice, but the rest of the people are disconnected.
Yeah. Anybody else have a question?
Anna Rosa had her hand.
Anna Rosa, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
No, yeah, I was just going to mention there are a couple of P2P technologies that I think I'm even thinking if I met Anna through Scuttlebot or not, because
there are P2P technologies that exist in the world, but they don't have a group-to-group autonomous network capacity, so they don't quite do.
Of course, Scuttlebot even is kind of growing through. There are a bunch of other things that are growing up from Scuttlebot, from the people from Scuttlebot. Kind of they move to many different ways. One of them are the guys from P2Panda, with which we work together with some apps as well. One app on bees. And yeah, but then as I found it very interesting what June also brought, like there, and that kind of also brings the reason why we at Melly couldn't be very active on social roots is because like our communities are very low on technology. So they actually have very low internet connection most of the time. So I work with a network of indigenous villages,
Yes. Yes.
indigenous and local communities basically. And then we kind of think, because yeah, of course, we are losing a lot because we basically use WhatsApp for communication. But yeah, so there are a bunch of things that grow on that topic. I do think it's kind of a very quite a big topic. At the same time, I do think, yeah, we need to somehow
Yeah, no, like this is like one of the challenges, right? Because when you're building tech like Mastodon, if you guys don't know, like Mastodon spent 10 years building, right? Over 10 years before it became sort of known in the last couple of years. And the problem is you're either going to get a bunch of funding from VCs and then you're going to have an exploitative ad tech, or you're going to be building very, very slowly. And unfortunately for civic tech, you end up doing the slow. And I agree with you. I would love to integrate with text. That's like one of the first things I want to do in the next phase of us. But I want to kind of give June a little more of the floor. Does anybody have any other questions for June?
But I think that's a wonderful opportunity of a little cluster that might meet together, in person or, on Zoom or asynchronously, so that's another piece. Well, we have a few minutes left, and I would just really like to hear from people, though the chat is very rich. I'm just dying to look at it after this, but I'd love to hear from people about, just like what insights, what new thinking did this spur in you? What do you want to learn more about, or meet with others about? Just what are your next steps? Do you have any ideas of how you might apply any of this? And if you let's go ahead and let's just I put it in the chat, yes, but just feel free to unmic and just share with us. Just
I can jump in straight ahead. Like I'm also seeing Christina here, so hi. And I do think like with networks, what I see is strongest on at least on the networks at Meli is that we have a lot of emerging outcomes. So things that we don't expect, and always to connect with people, interesting people like you guys. We kind of have interesting conversations and find out something quite different. So I'm very happy to be here and to start to open doors and to keep in touch with some of you. And yes, I'm quite happy on this.
And don't forget, there are those surveys in the chat. If you want to fill out like that general survey, it'll just let us know that you're interested in following up on this. But let's hear from a couple other people. Naryang, how about you? Like, did you learn anything new in this?
Way too much. I've been furiously taking notes. Unfortunately, in my own space, I could copy them over into the shared Miro, but everything you've shared has been highly relevant to what I'm doing. I'm in the middle right now of building a pitch deck to share to a funder of a network of networks that I'm working in to get them to recommit and introduce us to other funders in their network. So what you've been sharing about how a network can grow and some of the hard problems that you're seeing, I'm like, oh, I need to include this into the deck because I want to invite these funders into the conversation with me to help them think about how do we grow this network. And I think there's something in here that we all take for granted is that these networks of networks are so important. And I think I lose touch with that part.
Yeah.
When I'm out there doing the work and I feel like I'm like out there by myself. So coming back here has just been re-energizing, and I'm like, I want to take this energy I feel and put it into this deck so that other people can sort of see the value of these networks of networks.
Hey, and here's the thing that I'm offering. if I don't get overwhelmed. I will, if you have a funder and you're trying to convince them, and remember, I'm retired, right? And I have no stake in this whole thing, but I'm glad to come to a funder, and set up a Zoom conversation with them and talk to them about why it's so important to fund networks of networks. So if you know one that you want me to come and talk for a half an hour and whatever, I'd be glad to do that. Just let me know. My email is there, either June Holley at Gmail or at Network Weaving Institute. Corinne, did you have something you wanted to add? Oh dear. Well, how about
hello. I'm sorry. I couldn't figure out which one I was on. This is wonderful. It's perfect for what I needed. I'm so glad someone told me about it at the last minute. I am working on a directory for regenerative resources and also a library for regenerative solutions to disaster, including mitigation, prevention, and preparation. And that involves a tremendous amount of knowledge across the board. And I would love to just connect up with anyone who's interested in that, and also just keep learning in this system. I think it's wonderful to create an opportunity to learn more about networking with networks. So thank you.
Corinne, if you have your email address, if you put that in the survey or somewhere, because there were several people from Western North Carolina here on this call who just doing some brilliant work there. And if you want to get plugged in, maybe you already are, but if you aren't, I'd be glad to make some connections there.
I'm partially plugged in, probably not completely.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Any other last word? We just have a couple minutes left. Yeah, Tiffany Hart is there talking to you in the chat. Okay, David, go ahead.
Well, we've been playing with an approach that I think is kind of cool, but maybe there other people would want to play too. We've been doing, and June, you may have been to one of these like one-on-one networking with Zoom events, regeneration pollination, they're called.
Oh yeah.
And the thought is that we're not creating a network. We're a protocol that's just creating edges. So, right, and we just go from place to place. We hop from organization to organization, and we create edges. Is kind of the thought, or that's what I'm trying to develop the thought as anyway. And so we did one today where we, worked with the Joe Brewer's design school and invited people and did, kind of promoted him and did a lot of one-on-one networking. And they're like really cheap, easy kinds of sessions to do. And I just don't know why everybody's not doing them all the time. So I'd love to, anybody that's interested in that kind of thing and wants to either talk about them because want to talk about them or want to try to host one, let me know, especially if they're in the regeneration space. But it would work everywhere.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. And make sure if you want to save the chat, there's so many great connections and links in that chat there. I don't want you to forget about them. So
I'll send that as well.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you so much. So let's just say this is the beginning. I think there's just been a lot of great energy and thinking here. I'm going to try to actually incorporate some of the stuff from the chat into this deck. So it may be a little bit different when you actually see it. And I just hope that you can fill out the survey so that we can contact you and we know what you're interested in. So you're not overwhelmed, but you find out what's going to be happening. And please share this. When you get this video, this deck, feel free to share them widely with others so that we can get a whole community of people thinking about it's not just networks, it's networks of networks, and all the way up, all the way down.